Okay, then let's go ahead and call this meeting of Charlottesville City Council to order. Ms. Thomas, you take the call of the roll.
Councilor Payne,
Here.
Councilor Pinkston,
Here.
Mayor Snook.
Here. Okay.
Good evening, Council. We are here this evening to talk to you a little bit about the budget process and development. Hard to believe we're already ready to start talking about the FY24 budget. But as we've said before, that process doesn't stop. It's never ending. And so with that, we wanted to talk to you about a few things related to that. So we're going to talk about some key dates, the budget process review, some budget guidelines, look at a historical perspective on the general fund, as well as some trends, and then to talk about some key drivers. And then finally, we wanted to end up with an opportunity for council to ask questions or discuss anything about the budget, to also use this time as a chance to debrief from the cycle we just finished. And again, just to get your overall impressions. Not looking for any decisions tonight, but rather just to get you start thinking about this and let you know what we'll be looking for from you going forward. So jumping right in, I want to talk about a few key dates. Again, right now, February 6th will be the date that for all intents and purposes, the budget will be balanced. That is largely being driven because of the state requirement to advertise any real estate tax increases, and also a required rollback calculation has to be advertised a minimum of 30 days before the public hearing. And then any other taxes only require a 7-day advertisement. So February 6th will be the date in which pretty much the general fund will be balanced. On March 6th, that will be the presentation of the city manager. He will formally present the proposed budget to council, and the school board will present their proposed budget as well. There will be a public hearing on March 20th, a second public hearing on April 3rd, and then council will formally adopt the budget on April 11th. We also, during this time, will have a series of work sessions. We have been working with Ms. Thomas to get those on your calendar and get those firmed up. We'll also be publishing a budget public calendar soon on the website. But right now, we're looking for the first budget work session to be held on January 24th, and that will be more of a discussion about developing the budget. And then the following work sessions will be held once the city manager has presented the proposed budget to council. We have 4 of those scheduled, March 9th, March 16th, March 30th. And then if we need the final one, that would be held on April 6th. Talking about the process itself, the capital improvement process comes first. Requests will be due at the end of September, early October. We plan to include a planning commission member on the review team. And also we are tentatively looking to hold a work session with the planning commission on the proposed CIP on November 22nd and hold the public hearing with the planning commission and council on December 13th. City departments will also be working on their operating budgets, preparing those packages and requests. They'll be due the end of October. The city manager and the budget team will be meeting with department heads and their team to discuss their budget request. And those are in the process of being scheduled, and they'll be held in the month of November and early December. In addition, the nonprofit and outside agency applications will be underway. I think the current timeline being discussed will be to have those due at around the end of October, early November. And then those applications will be reviewed and the recommendations will be completed in early January. We'll have several opportunities for public engagement as it relates to the budget. We've added a new opportunity this year, which is the city manager budget forum. This will be held on January 10th at the Carver Recreation Center. And this will be an opportunity for the city manager to make a presentation, as well as for the public to have an opportunity to express its feedback to the city manager before the budget is actually finalized and presented to council. In addition, there'll be a community budget forum that will be held on either March 22nd or 23rd. And this is an opportunity for the public to discuss directly with council its desires or wishes regarding the budget. And then finally, we will offer public comment opportunities at least 2 of the public hearings that are scheduled, and there will be public comment available at the end of each budget work session. So as we move along, some of the things that drive the budget and that we look to when making decisions for what's in and what's out are the budget guidelines and the strategic goals. These are things that we ask council to review and to comment on each year, make sure that we're making the mark as we prepare the budget. And so some of those guidelines and goals are whether or not you want to maintain the current real estate and personal property tax. We look to develop operational budgets within projected available revenues. That means that we are required to adopt a budget that is balanced, meaning that expenditures must balance to available revenues. We also try to include things that focus on council's strategic vision. Some of those breakdowns have been economic sustainability, a center for lifelong learning, quality housing opportunities for all, Charlottesville arts and culture, a green city, America's healthiest city, a connected community, community of mutual respect, and smart citizen-focused government. Again, these are areas that council can weigh in on. We can change those, we can move them around. So we want you to start thinking about that as we start into this budget season. Again, we also, using these strategic visions, we want to incorporate performance measures to make sure that we are making the mark on the priorities that have been set forth, or to discover the ones that we're not and figure out why we aren't. Additionally, we want to continue the strong commitment to education. We have for years used the 40% of new city real estate and property tax revenue formula in determining the additional local funding that goes to schools. We want to invest strategically in our employees by providing adequate pay and benefits, training, support, and appreciation. We also annually review the living wage ordinance, which is the ordinance that dictates pay in city contracts for non-professional services. We also need to decide how we're going to fund new programs or major expansion. Will that be with only if they're fully offset by revenues, or will we reduce in other areas to add those expenses? Finally, as we look to the CIP, we want to make sure that we are not only doing the bright, new, shiny things, but we are also investing in our existing infrastructure and facilities. We want to transfer at least 3% of our general fund expenditures or pay-go to the capital improvement program. We want to talk about whether or not we want to build in a reserve for council strategic initiatives. You all have an account that you have used for years to draw down on sort of one-time types of things. Do you need more funds there? And then finally, we budget for the fund balance target adjustment pool. As you know, we maintain our fund balance policy of 17%. And while that percent does not change, as the budget grows, that amount that is required to maintain the 17% does increase. And so we budget an offset to that to help make sure we meet that mark. We also look to the budget to make sure we're in keeping with our long-term financial policies. Again, items 1 and 2 here are addressing our 17% policy. 14% of which is required in the fund balance, but also the downturn reserve of 3%, which, as you recall, has some fairly specific restrictions on what that can be used, when that can be used, and when it must be replenished. We also maintain sufficient working capital in the utility funds. We want to make sure that all non-general funds are stabilized with a positive fund balance. Our debt service policy, which we've talked about a lot, is our ratio of 10% or less with a target of 9. And then we transfer an equivalent of 1 cent of the meals tax revenue to the debt service fund to help offset future debt service needs. So keeping all this in mind, what does the future look like? What might this budget look like? We wanted to take a look back at an historical perspective of the general fund. And in this graph here, you will see the bars represent the size of the general fund from 2014 to 2023. The blue bars indicate our years in which there was sort of an uptick from the year before, and they indicate years in which either we passed tax increases, or in the case of 2018, we had a significant increase in commercial property assessments, which was largely due to new construction, which added $7 million. So as you see, this trend line tends to kind of ebb and flow. And then you'll see here from 20 to 21, 22, this is the COVID effect. And then from 22 to 23, both we are recovering from COVID with our recovering revenues, but then also we had 2 tax increases that were passed in the budget, the penny on the real estate tax, the 0.5% on the meals tax, and we also had a significant real estate property assessment increase as well. So if we look at that just on a percent change from year to year, 2008 was the last recorded recession, if you will. And you'll notice that this trend line is very similar to what our budget trend line looks like, where we have an uptick in 2008, we kind of ebb and flow all the way through, and then we have a pretty big uptake again in 2023. The average of all of those over time is about 3.9%, and that's this trend line that you see here in the middle of this graph. So interestingly enough, if we take a look at the CPI trends, which is an indication of inflation, you'll see that that graph or trend line looks very similar. Again, there's sort of this uptick in 2008, with the shaded area being the last recorded recession. There's a lot of ebb and flows. And then on this high end here, we're back up. So what does that mean in terms of going forward for the general fund? It means that we anticipate that FY23 will sort of level off without this. Again, this is assuming no tax increases here. We are assuming that the general fund will grow at a more modest projected growth of about 3 to 4% a year, which would equate to roughly $7 or $8 million. And as we know, if you choose to keep the normal school formula with 40% going to schools, if we were to have a budget of $7 million growth, that would equate to just over 4 million at 4.2 million for the city. If we made it to 8 million, that would be about $4.8 million that we would have in new funds to add to the general fund going forward. So as you know, how would we spend that money? What will we spend it on? There are a few drivers that we already are aware of that will be significant factors in the 2024 budget. We know that cost increases due to supply chain issues and inflation are a real factor, both in capital projects, but just general operations as well. It's not clear what the revenue impact of any potential recession will be, but we need to keep an eye on that. Employee compensation, both collective bargaining and compensation study are underway, and we'll have significant needs that will need to be addressed. There will be funding needs for the city schools. In addition, the ability to fund new requests from city departments. We know that we We'll also be absorbing recurring costs that we've added with one-time ARP and other grant funds that need to be absorbed in the general fund budget, as well as looking at funding other needs and priorities that may come out of council's strategic plan or other things that will come up during the budget cycle. Any one of these bullets could easily use up the $4 million that we are anticipating that we might be working with in terms of growth for 24. And that concludes the formal part of my presentation. At this point, we wanted to open this back up for council feedback, to talk about any big issues that you have on your mind that you think may be drivers of the budget. What information would you like to see? Debrief again from the process we just went through. Are there things you'd like to change? Or any other items that you would like to discuss at this point? We'll be happy to have a conversation about that now, and I'll open it up to you.
Brian, you want to lead us off?
Ms. Hamill, it's very nice to see you. It's been a while.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. The first question I had, so we just received an email from Councilor McGill about the change the budget deadline. She says the April 15th deadline is a self-imposed deadline. It does not really have a reason I can determine. Another reason is that the first week of April is Charlottesville spring break. So I'll forward this on to you, and maybe you can think about, you and others, how that might, what impacts that might involve.
We'll be back.
Oh, yeah.
Talked about it.
Got plenty of time, don't we? Yeah, and
Yeah.
then I guess the other question I had, and this is really more broadly, has to do with the strategic plan, updating our strategic plan. I think your volume's on there.
It's not supposed to be. I'm trying to make sure it's off. Well, I've been muted, so.
Okay. So these budget points that Ms. Hamill has made, they all reflect what I guess we would say at this point is a pretty old strategic plan. I'm having a hard time remembering. I know we had our retreat in April. Does anyone remember what sort of the next steps were on, or had we even thought of next steps in terms of rebooting our strategic plan? And if not, is this a good time to start thinking about this? Or should we have thought about it 6 months ago?
Well, if you recalled in that session we had, we made good use of it because you were able to identify
Yep.
a number of items that were important to the council
Yep.
for funding. And we came back and presented those to you, and you voted on those. In terms of rebooting the strategic plan, we've included in the ARP allocation tonight an amount of funds that would allow us to acquire the services of a consultant to work with us on doing that.
Okay.
And so I think that the time is ripe. You've got a lot on our plate, but in doing the strategic plan right, we'll get a consultant who will engage you individually and collectively over the next few months. And by the time we get to April, we ought to have
Okay.
a new direction, or at least some themes,
Okay.
if we're not finished, in terms of where you might want to allocate additional dollars.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's good that we're even discussing it this early. I guess some more specific thoughts I had are in terms of things I'm thinking through of priorities is one, how do we get a dollar amount on what it's going to take to deal with the wage compression issues throughout the organization as part of the wage and compensation study? I'm guessing that's a number that's going to come with a little bit of sticker shock, but it's obviously an investment I don't think we have a choice to make, and just curious how we get a hold of that early in the process to make sure we're incorporating it. In addition to that, the climate action planning process, Do we expect that we're going to get estimates for new programs or initiatives that are recommended as part of that process in line with this upcoming budget process so we can incorporate them? And finally, a discussion of how can we get our adopted affordable housing plan and that $10 million a year into a more stable place in terms of expectations of how we'll fund it at $10 million a year, which is what the plan calls for, rather than sort of trying to figure out each budget cycle whether we can do that or not. And along with that, the regional transit vision and our public transit plans long-term. How do we get in a place where we have some clear numbers and making sure that's incorporated into our budget process? These are some of the specific big ticket items I'm thinking about. In terms of the process, I think it sounds like those public community forums, I think, will be very positive. Obviously, we couldn't do those with COVID, but I think that will be positive, yeah, and just kind of like what we're doing now, where we're starting the conversation as early as we can. I mean, I think the fact we're even having this conversation tonight is a very good first step and sign of how this upcoming budget process will go.
Mm-hmm. Let me respond to a couple of items that you raised. One, with respect to wages for the employees, there are two drivers. One is the compensation study that is underway, and we're well into it now. We expect to be completed with that by the end of the year. That will tell us where we are compared to other jurisdictions in the region in terms of our salaries. It will define a competitiveness gap, and we have to decide within that where we want to be. Secondly, collective bargaining is coming right behind that. We will be coming to you on August 15th with a proposed collective bargaining ordinance. Then there will be some public hearings after that, and it will be up for first reading at the first meeting in September, and second reading the second meeting in September. And we expect that there will be a push to begin to recognize collective bargaining units after that as we implement. But the compensation study will define a certain level of where we are. We decide what we do about that. Whatever we have done in terms of increasing the police department wages and what we're proposing with the fire department and the sheriff's department and whatever we do in transportation, all of that is a down payment, if you will, against the gap in competitiveness of our salaries overall. And I think it will all work out in the end. And what we do on the front end has to be recognized at the bargaining table when we get there. And how much that will be, how much our gap is at this point, it's too soon to tell. I've been, we have presentations from our consultant. I'm looking for them to share that with me, but we're not there yet. And, I would not want to estimate or forecast what that gap would be yet, but I'll get back to you as soon as we know.
When do we think we might have some idea from them, final product?
The final product will be in December.
December. Okay.
Yeah, that's the current schedule. And so it will be as we are preparing for the budget. It will fall right in line with the budget schedule, so it's something that we will have to deal with in '24.
Okay. Well, if it comes in December, that's early enough so that it can get incorporated into the budget.
Yes.
If it was coming in March, that'd be a little late.
Yeah, that'd be a little more difficult, yes.
Yeah.
Do we know if the climate action planning process, is that still on schedule to have a somewhat similar timeline, so it could be incorporated at least in part this budget cycle?
Yeah. Is Sam Sanders nearby? I know we talked about that this afternoon. I know that the climate team is working. Sam may have some additional comments.
Yes, sir. What I'll say to you in regards to the question is, yes, there will be an ongoing effort as we advance to the finalization of the document that will be presented to council. We're anticipating that coming to council at this moment in October, early October. And the team will continue to work from that document being received by you and responded to by you to formulate any requests from a budget perspective within public works submission in the upcoming round with Ms. Hamill.
Okay.
So one of the other topics that seems like every year we don't have time to actually deal with, but we sort of gripe about it in passing, is the 40% figure for the schools.
Yes.
And sometimes it's with the idea that that's not enough money for the schools. Other times it's with a sense of resentment that we're having to give them 40% of our new revenues. And other times it's, particularly now when we're looking to be plunking $68 million into things for the schools. There are those who have said to us, why are you promising to give them 40%, 40%, and 40% when you're giving them $68 million? Can't you figure that in there somewhere? Has there been any thought about revisiting that formula? And I have no particular opinion about which
Right.
one of these is correct, but it just, we keep hearing this, too late to do anything.
Right. Well, I'll say a couple of things. One, the 40% we looked at last year, that was determined long ago. But the other reality is we are the source of school needs. We fund them. And they come to us like for the reconfiguration. We understand that there will be some additional needs this year. Most of it should be covered in the 40%, but council has it's your decision whether you want to maintain that level, and if so, with what conditions, over time, and what's included in it. You could cap it and allocate funds somewhere else, but that is a decision that the council, the policymakers are going to have to grapple with.
And I would just add to that if that's something that council wishes to do, schools are developing their budget at the same time that we are. And so that would be something that you would want to tackle ahead of time and not wait until we're in the midst of our budget work sessions. So now would be a good time to start talking about that.
I'm not even sure how to begin that discussion, in part because I'm not familiar enough with how the original formula was derived a decade or so ago, and maybe at some point I should be looking through all of that old material. But the discussion has been most pronounced in terms of trying to figure out, obviously the school has capital needs as well as operating needs, and we have just committed ourselves to a huge capital addition to them.
That's right.
And I don't know, and I certainly don't want to be hamstringing their operational needs. But I also know that there are a lot of taxpayers who write me letters and emails saying, if you didn't give all that money to the schools, you could cut our taxes. And clearly that's but you don't even know why they're spending the money. I mean, we can see we get a budget presentation, it's an hour long, but that's obviously not even scratching the surface of what's going on. And so all I can say to folks is, hey, you all vote for the school board members just like you vote for us, and we're going to deal with the constraints that that are created for us, and we're certainly not going to sit there and say we're going to to make sure that the schools are underfunded.
Right.
I wonder if it would be worthwhile having a preliminary sort of conversation with them, with Ms. Powell, perhaps. Ms. Hamill, wasn't it the case that this last time the incremental tax revenue we raised with the 1 cent real estate tax increase, we didn't give 40% of that to them. The whole thing went basically to pay for the school capital piece. Remember, there was something unusual about this last. In the most recent budget, we had some arrangement where the revenue that we raised went specifically for the capital project. Am I remembering that right?
You are. So I have a chart that I can share as well. And we did end up with the, because of the tax increase, the contribution, the total contribution that went to schools was slightly less than the 40%. But to your point, we used some of that to put in the debt service fund to help
Right.
fund the additional debt service that would be required for both the school project. If you remember that chart with the 3-year incremental increase by adding the 68 million.
It's seared right
and the
here in my
rest of the
cerebellum.
CIP.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, we will, with you having raised that issue, we'll tee this up for a deeper dive and come back with you, because I think as this would be a major change, and I'm certain that we all want to know, what the implications long-term will be, if there is a change in current policy. So we will, budget team, and we'll talk with schools as well. And at some point, the council probably should have that meeting with schools to discuss, an issue like this. So, be of one accord moving forward.
What is the normal process in terms of when we meet with the school board? Is it almost always sort of the first part of the next year, or is there an earlier?
Late January typically,
Okay.
last week of January, first week of February.
Is there value in meeting in the fall, perhaps?
I don't know what their procedures are, whether they'd be far enough along.
Okay.
Because obviously there's the flow, in order to not be wasting each other's time, they've got things they've got to do first.
Right.
The question is, if we look at things and we say, we know that we're going to sort of project the same 3% increase in the general fund, that's going to work out to another $6 to $7 million. And they would probably get 40% of that. That's going to turn out to be roughly $3 million. So that's going to leave us $4 million if we don't raise taxes.
Right.
If we don't raise tax rates.
Right.
If we look at $4 million and we say, we know that the wage and comp study is telling us that we've got to have $3 million more added to wages, now all of a sudden we've got very little room to deal with the rest of our inflation. And then we have to start looking at tax increases and so on. If we have another year where car taxes, where car values rise 20 or 30%, which I don't think we will, but I think we may well see the same 20 to 30% persist for another year. Or if we have another year where we've got an 11% increase again in assessments, I think that we would have a lot of opposition from folks if we said, oh, and we're also going to raise rates by 2-3 cents or whatever. I mean, we saw that already this first year. It would be dramatically greater if the same thing happened 2 years in a row.
Right. And this past year, we had a really clear reason, which was the schools project was really what we needed to push that through the sort of tunnel. One thing I would also like to, and it was in the progress, I was just looking, one thing we should certainly keep in mind in terms of risk mitigation is the impact of construction cost escalation on the schools project. We'll see. I understand they're getting pricing, should have pricing back on this set of drawings in the next month or two. We'll have to see how that looks, but that could certainly be there could be a hit there. So I think just thinking in terms of that possible risk is another thing we have to factor into all of this.
Yeah, and I would just add also, along with the school discussion, in 21, they were able to not ask for any additional funding from the city because they had one-time CARES money they were able to balance with. And when we got to this year's budget, we were able to close, that was roughly $4 million, and we were able to close a lot of that gap. But I believe I recall from Ms. Powell's presentation that while we closed most of it, there was still a gap in what was still being covered with one-time money, in addition to any impact that collective bargaining would have with them, the things we know about bus drivers, and other things. So they are going to be looking at operational increases that will, be significant as well.
Yeah.
We also have the fire department, the SAFER grant will be ending shortly, and that's going to be a little over $2 million a year or more that we have to roll into the budget, as well as if we roll in the ARPA request as a
Yes.
long-term request as well. So
Yeah, we pretty much included in our thinking the SAFER grants, and that was under the discussion at the end of our last budget year, and we'll pick that up with our year-end, surplus. But that's, for the year going forward.
Right.
So we've accounted for that $2 million.
I just always keep bringing that back.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Yeah, and I would like to second what Councilor Payne mentioned in terms of transit and housing. I know that the regional transit vision plan and all those things are moving forward, but the horizon always seems to be slipping a little further and further away. And so I do hope, and my expectation would be that Mr. Williams, I'm sure, is working on what he needs for his part of that. And I hope, we'll be proactive in thinking about what that looks like. And then the same for housing. We've made a commitment of $10 million a year, and so I'm hoping that we'll see really solid requests and proposals for that. I know we're going to talk about the hack later on tonight, but those are some of the larger things
Right.
to think about. And I know y'all are doing this, but when I talk to people out in the community about the city, one of my major impressions is the fact that I just feel like we're still understaffed. There's so much work to be done, and this community wants a lot of good work done, and it takes people to do that. And so I'm not saying go nuts in terms of requesting staffing, but I would just encourage people to think clearly and about what is it going to take to operationalize these things that we say we want as a city. And most of the time that's going to involve some people, or perhaps hiring a consultant, as the case may be. But anyway.
Also, I've noticed in a lot of my conversations with people who are concerned about taxes and their tax rates in particular, that they want plenty of services, but they don't think that they think that city employees are overpaid. And I've tried to tell folks that having a good city staff is not going to be cheaper than having an underpaid city staff.
Right.
So,
And as we saw their last meeting, we have some pretty serious compression issues already when we have somebody who's been is getting ready to retire and is making close to the same wage that somebody new coming in is.
And those are very serious issues that partly the compensation study will help us sort through. And I think that in transportation particularly, we have a serious challenge there. We need more drivers, and we need to be more competitive with surrounding transportation agencies, so maybe some of our employees will come back, or we keep the ones that we have, and we're working on that. I've spent half the day today working with Sam and Mr. Williams discussing those issues, and we'll be coming forward with an approach to address that immediate issue. But then the long-term issue of financing of transportation, using the annual federal dollars that we get in a way that is beneficial to us, that's another part of the conversation that we have to have and need to work on in the coming weeks. And we're focused on it.
So I guess the question that I've got for you, Mr. Rogers, Ms. Hamel, is there something that you need from us in the next 2 or 3 months that we can be working on?
Well, I think that thinking, you've raised some issues here, and thinking deeper about this and what you want to see, like on affordable housing, we can try and make that commitment that you've been able to do over the last several years and continue that commitment. But what's your benchmarks? What does success look like in the application of those $2 million, to you? And how do we set that up in a way that it is successful going forward? In terms of regional transit, the long-term play is probably the discussion about a regional transit agency. And what are the dynamics that need to be in place for us to move that forward? It's been talked about a long time, but if the community is really in favor of, how do we move it forward? And what are the steps? And what's the timeline? What's the end game on it?
Right, that's a really good point. And Lloyd, you're on the RTP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're both on. Sorry, we're on some different things, but the Regional Transit Partnership, and that is itself another study that's ongoing in terms of governance. And these things take, I think that one is like 18 months out.
Yeah.
Maybe a year out. So it is remarkable how long these things take to sort of get.
It is.
And then we'll have to get, agreement amongst the various jurisdictions.
Right. And the city's going to have to be positioned to what at stake, what does success look like for the city and for this to happen, as we discuss governance and position the operations going forward. I mean, we have assets, and what happens to those assets going into a new authority? How do we position that? These are all questions that we need to think through.
Right.
And I would, a little separate, but adding to, initiatives that have sort of begun but aren't finished that came to mind is, how do we tee up the Marcus Alert system? I know we allocated a little bit of money this past budget cycle, but is there going to be additional money that we're going to need to invest to stand that up quicker, as well as stand up like crisis intervention teams, as well as implement all of the recommendations from the 2 criminal justice reform work groups from over a year ago at this point, but they had a whole list of recommendations, obviously, and that's something which we made a little bit of progress on last budget cycle, but like transit and housing, there's a lot more to go and budget out and plan for.
Right. There's a place to tee that up as well. I'm glad you added that to the list. Chris, Ms. Hamill, any other items you want to add?
Sir, I think we covered it. I mean, I think if, we can definitely, the question about the schedule or the calendar is probably one we should talk about sooner than later. I will add that while it is perhaps a deadline we can change, there is a fair amount of work that needs to be done once the budget is passed in terms of getting bills out, to get them out timely so that we meet our due dates for June 5th, as well as loading budgets. And so there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background. Doesn't mean we don't have room to change it, but we would want to talk about it. And I guess in particular, if I'm not mistaken, that last week in April is a regular scheduled council meeting on April 3rd. And so, as we talk about whatever feedback you want to have about that schedule or changing that schedule, we probably need to look at that sooner than later.
I've just brought, this is based on an email I sent out while watching this at the doctor's office. I have brought this up every year, that this meeting keeps falling into Charlottesville school spring break. And it's just one more way that it makes it harder for some people to serve on council. And so, and while it's a meeting that may or may not happen, so far it's happened every year I've been here. And so I just want to, and when I brought this up last year, I was told that we set the schedule and that's why it happens then. And if we pushed it even just a few weeks, we could change a few things. So I just want to bring that forward, that this is a clash that does make it harder for anybody with children who go to our public school system to participate as a counselor.
My impression is that most places are at least a month ahead of the Charlottesville schedule in terms of how they prepare a budget. Is that an accurate assessment?
I'm not sure.
We cut it
honestly.
closer to the line than just about any place that I've seen, as I look at reports from other jurisdictions in Virginia in particular.
You mean in terms of work sessions or the adopted date, or?
Well, in terms of the adopted date, and I mean, there are places, particularly in Northern Virginia, where council is involved in budget discussions by December. They're not waiting until February or March. And the practical effect of what we do is that our opportunity for actually commenting on things is compressed into about 4 weeks. And there are a couple of meetings in the meantime, and people have been having public comments, talking about things, in many cases talking about a budget that hasn't been produced yet. We have very little opportunity for the public to react to the city manager's budget, and for us then to ponder in any meaningful way any changes we might wish to make to the city manager's budget. And so I'm just wondering whether there is a way for us to decompress that schedule a little bit, to make things happen a little bit earlier, instead of having the city manager's budget come out the first week in March, maybe it comes out the first week in February. And then we can have our discussion about what we want to do before spring break, not after. Recognizing that if we get much beyond April 15th, as Ms. Hamill noted, there are all kinds of problems for the tax folks in getting out the tax bills. Unless we want to take the position, as we did in 2020, that we were going to set the amount of the revenues, and we would sort out the expenditure side by June. That's not really a good way to do it. We kind of had to do it in COVID times, but I'm not sure it's a model we want to emulate, on purpose anyway.
Well, having heard your concern, Ms. Hamill and I and the staff will go back and look at it and see what, submitting the city manager's budget in February, that means that we will roll right into the new budget preparation right after the fiscal year closes, after we adopt the budget. And It would have to be in order to move it back a month, but we'll look at it and see how we can meet your concern.
Well,
Because I-
there's definitely always the opportunity, to have work sessions to discuss budget development as well ahead of time. Sometimes it feels like as we are preparing the budget, to your point about that compressed time for discussing things in February, as much as you are reacting to the city manager's proposed budget, a lot of times that's the first time we're discussing issues as well.
Right.
And so there might be some opportunities, to have some work sessions ahead of that, i.e., if you want to talk about the school formula, or if you wanted to talk about some of these other more lofty goals about, to Mr. Rogers' point earlier, what does meeting the mark for affordable housing plan look like to you? We could certainly have a lot of those. And the last work session that we have in April is really, if you recall, the one we had this last April, it was really kind of, okay, these are all the things you've talked about. What do you want to do? So if we talked about them earlier, then we could maybe address those in the city manager's budget in the forefront too.
Well, I'm just suggesting if we're concerned that delaying the process past April 15th gets us into trouble in the Commissioner of Revenue's office and various other places because there are deadlines that we cannot move there. If we're going to try to make it so that we have that decision made at a time that is not school vacation time, the only alternative is to move it ahead of that, to move it earlier.
I would note, I don't know if it's a better or bad idea, but just looked it up. I don't know if they were anomalies, but the past 2 years, Albemarle adopts their budget the first week of May. So,
Okay.
We'll
we'll
look
look at
we'll look
those.
at the options. We'll look at the options and come back. We have another discussion on
Sure.
it. All right.
Any other questions or conversation on the issue? By the way, welcome.
Thank you.
There being nothing else that we have to talk about right now, I guess we should recess until 6:30 and come back at that point for the evening business session.
Okay. Very good.
We're in recess. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hamill.
Thank you.
No closed meeting, huh?